Hi, friends. I have a big favor to ask of you. I'm asking that for the next hour and a half, that you give your undivided attention to this episode. I know that's a big ask, but I truly want you to hear everything in it from start, middle, and end, because there are so many important aspects. We dive into so many different topics in this conversation that have the power to change the world. And I want you to hear it. And to warm you up to today's guest, some of you might already know because I have been so excited. I had the absolute honor of sitting down with Ken Ramirez. He's a world-renowned animal trainer, educator, and conservationist. Ken's been a professional trainer for over 50 years, and he's currently the chief training officer at Karen Pryor Clicker Training. He's not only the author of 3 books on training, but he also teaches professional trainers at his working ranch in Seattle. His work has shaped and continues to shape the field of animal behavior, animal care, and training across zoos, aquariums, conservation projects, and for companion animal spaces for the dogs in your home. Ken has spent over 2 decades leading the animal care and training programs at the Shed Aquarium, where he worked with over 32,000 animals. He's pioneered conservation training and still oversees groundbreaking projects all over the world, such as rerouting elephant migration patterns to avoid poachers and teaching conservation dogs to avoid venomous snakes. He blends the logical with the emotional sides of things so brilliantly and brings practical solutions to real-world problems all over the world. This conversation, if you couldn't tell, meant the world to me. And it's not just because of Ken's deep expertise, but because we touched on the intersection of so many important things like science, conservation, and emotional intelligence and emotional connection in a way that I think everyone needs to hear, no matter if you're just an animal lover, an animal trainer, or a naturalist. This is something that I think you need to hear. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Hey friends, and welcome to the Co-Regulated Canines podcast. I'm Ashley Cipoletti, your host, and I'm on a mission to create more connection. Dogs are really just the starting point. Together, we'll explore how to live with more harmony, ease, and healing so we can show up more as the best version of ourselves, not just for our dogs, but also for our community and our planet too. So grab a coffee and let's dive in. I'm here with a very special guest, someone whose work has deeply influenced animal welfare, behavior science, conservation, and honestly, my own path too, the one and only Ken Ramirez. Ken, it's truly such an honor to have you here. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah. And so I had known of you and your work for years, kind of throughout more of the dog training lens. But I remember hearing you on Michael Shikashio's podcast somewhat recently. And he was actually our last guest. So full circle moment. But I remember completely freaking out when you were talking about your work in conservation, specifically how you're working with elephants and polar bears and really applying behavior science to these conservation efforts. And then the timing of the episode was also crazy to me. It was right around the same time I started dreaming up of a similar idea, putting kind of my behavior science brain into conservation problems. So when I heard you speak of it, it was like the universe was saying, oh my gosh, this is possible. This exists. Keep going. So thank you again. I feel like you're a big inspiration to me of knowing that that is something that's possible to work towards.
Yeah, it's a very unique area of interest of mine and passion of mine working in conservation, and but it isn't something that usually people put conservation and animal training together. There's that perception that, well, these animals live in the wild, they live in nature. How could we as trainers ever impact their lives in a meaningful or positive way? And it's sort of been a little niche that I've cut out for myself over the years. So I'm glad it's something you're interested in, and I'm happy to talk about that if that's where you want to go with this conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's thinking too, you always mention this, that these behavior science principles they're always happening, right? It's a science. And so when you're aware of it, you can use it strategically. It's not necessarily manipulation, it's already in at play. And I love that you thought about that with these conservation projects, because I did too. I was like, this is all just like antecedent arrangements and things like that.
That's exactly what it is. And I think a lot of times when people are not familiar with training or don't have a deep knowledge of training, it seems like this mysterious and magical process. But I always remind people that animals, people learn 24 hours a day. We learn in every interaction we have, and sometimes those interactions are pleasing and pleasant and positive, and so that causes those behaviors to happen more. Sometimes those interactions are unpleasant or negative in some way, and it causes those behaviors not to happen as much. And if you become aware of that, you become aware that you can impact another individual's behavior all the time. And it's all just a matter of being thoughtful of what it is that that individual is learning at the time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I came across something, you'll have to like fact check me on it, that you've now worked close to, is it 900 different species, or I don't know if you lost track, but
You know, it's people have asked me that question before, and it's funny because I've never actually, I don't have a number that I know, but inevitably when someone asks me, I then go off and start writing down and kind of calculating out the number of species. And it is a lot, and it's up there in numbers because I have worked with so many and had the good fortune, to get my career started working with dogs, and that led me to working in a zoological environment, and that led me to working in conservation training. And so before you know it, the number of species whose lives that I've had some impact on is kind of amazing to me, even when I look at the
yeah.
total numbers.
Yeah, no, I have like goosebumps thinking about it. And then I think you were on, I don't remember whose podcast it was, but I was listening to it and you were chatting about how you recently worked with jellyfish, and then that kind of sparked some curiosity in doing this work with plants, which makes sense to me, but I would love to hear you dive a little bit deeper into that.
Into the jellyfish issue or the plant issue? Which one?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of both. Like, yeah, a summary of both I think is just fascinating. People would be interested in.
So yeah, the interesting thing about jellies, if people don't know much about them, we technically in the field refer to them as sea jellies because they're not technically fish. But jellies are very interesting because they do not have what most people think of as a brain. They do not have uh, they are these creatures that sort of people think are not teachable because they don't have a lot. They don't have appendages, so they don't have a lot of well, they have appendages, but they don't have arms and legs, and they don't have the ability to walk and move. But you do have the ability. The sea jellies do eat. They need to have access to food, and if you're able to place the food in strategic places, you can actually cause them to move from place to place. And I was working on a project with an organization in Japan, and they were trying to get people really motivated by about sea jellies. And of course, one of the things that a lot of people who display sea jellies do is they put them in these beautiful tanks that have lights behind them. And because sea jellies are somewhat translucent and see through, those colors that they put on the jellies can really make them pop out and stand out. And but of course, sometimes the jellies have this undulating pulsing that they do, but they don't swim fast anywhere. They just sort of float through the water. But if you always feed them in a certain location at a certain time, you will see that the sea jellies will gravitate in that direction. And so, for a project that we were doing to illustrate how animals can learn and how we can affect their behavior, we created this sequence where the aquarium in Japan used music, and while that music was playing, on certain beats, the aquarist who was feeding them would come over and drop food into one side of the tank, and 900 jellies all sort of moved to that side, and you could hear the audience go ooh, and then at the next phrasing of music, he moved his food over to the other side, and all the jellies moved, and it seemed as if they were moving to the music, and it just illustrated to people how all creatures learn all the time, and it's how they survive, it's how they adapt to their environment, it's how they uh, deal with predators. It's how they find food. It's how they find shelter. It's how they find a mate. There's so much of that has to do with learning, and learning takes place all the time. And oftentimes, when we do training, we are able to either illustrate the beauty of training, as we were doing with the sea jellies, or sometimes it can be the utility of training, as we've done frequently with guide dog training or service dog training. And so training is an amazing uh, profession, and there are so many ways that we can apply it, so that eventually when it came to, when COVID came around a few years ago, uh, everyone was thinking about, well, how can we detect COVID and how can we do things about it? And suddenly people had the creative idea of using the dog's nose to help detect COVID, and it became something that was an interesting experiment. Thankfully, COVID hasn't been a major issue for us in recent years, but it still exists. And now we have dogs that can detect COVID by just sniffing of the person and saying yes, you do or do not have COVID. It's just amazing how much we are able to do as trainers when working with an amazing creature such as a dog.
Yeah, no, that's so fascinating. And it almost sparked this realization in me that learning can happen again without a brain. It's almost like a cellular learning, which would make sense. You could probably get it down to like you could teach bacteria and like really like dive in that, which is maybe what that science is like. I don't know, but
Yeah, it is fascinating when you start realizing that learning is taking place. And you mentioned plants earlier. Botanists and gardeners have often taken plants like vines that grow in a certain direction, and they will talk about the fact that they are teaching the plant to grow in a certain direction. And a big part of that is setting the environment up with the sticks or the trellis or the things that you need so that the plant has a direction to grow. But with a little bit of thought and the use of sunlight and water, you're able to, I hesitate to use the word teach, but you can teach the plant to grow to the left or to grow to the right or to grow straight up or to grow across the ground, and that is considered a type of learning. And no one thinks about plants as having this great mental capacity. They don't have brains at all, but yet plants don't simply just grow. They grow in certain ways, and through training, you can teach them. And this is not an area that I have expertise in, of course, but yeah, there's a lot of teaching that can even happen with what people think of as can't even call it an individual, but with
right.
plants. And so uh, the science behind teaching and learning is quite extensive, and people's minds are beginning to get opened up slightly more now as they learn about the kinds of things that can be taught to an animal.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense because it's really like, especially if we're using food in training, that's something like an animal or an individual would need for survival. So you're strategically or thoughtfully, you know, using the timing of that. But with plants, they would get that from sunlight and from water. So similar concept, just a different like source because they're not eating. I mean, maybe depending on the plant, but most of them aren't like eating
Yeah.
things like in that way. So that's, yeah, really interesting thought experiment. So out of, I guess, all of the species you've worked with, I feel like one of the things I admire most about you is your just curiosity and empathy towards not just the species, but the individual. So has there been a specific individual of a species that's not a dog that has like changed the way you train or just challenged the way you think?
It's hard to pick out one particular individual that's impacted me the most, but certainly many have, and it's either because of the amount of time I've spent with an individual, allowing me to gain a relationship, and that relationship has mattered a great deal to me. When you think about the kinds of relationships that we develop with our pets, that bond can be very, very strong, and that bond can be extremely meaningful to you as an individual. And it's not relegated to just dogs or cats. As when you work with animals over a period of time, um, and you end up building relationships in different ways. When I work with an animal on a daily basis and develop a close bond with that animal, like a dog, you can't help but have special moments and special memories that you build with that animal. And each training challenge that you come across gives you new insight, forces you to think about training in different ways, uh, teaches you how to be compassionate. But even with training like the elephant project that I'm working on in Africa, these are wild, free ranging elephants who I don't build a relationship with. The difference in a lot of our training that we do with our animals every day, we build relationships with these individuals. But with conservation training, our goal is not to build a relationship. We don't want those animals to become dependent on humans or to become hopeful that we are going to help them or interact with them in some particular way. And so it's a hands off approach, but yet we are still arranging the environment to help teach that animal something that will save its life. And as I have been working with this particular elephant project now, started doing studies and preparing for it back in 2009, and now here we are in 2025, and we're still working on this project, and we have several years ahead. There are individual elephants within that group that I have gotten to know well, but not on a personal, intimate basis, but just learning about them, seeing their activity, watching their interactions with the other elephants. I feel like I have a very strong understanding of individuals within that herd. I feel like I know them well, even though I don't know them on a personal basis. They don't know me, but I know them. And it allows me to, it's just opened my eyes to the way elephants work, the way their social interactions are important to them. There's so much deep meaning that I've gotten that probably one of the most current animals that has had the biggest impact on me is an elephant named Malala, who I've never personally met. I've seen her up close, I've seen her from a distance, I've watched her interact, but because I've been involved in that project for such a long period of time, I've learned a great deal from her and from many of her herd companions that has affected my learning. And so, back to your original question, is there an individual animal that has affected me? There are many that have affected me in that way. Whether it's Malala, who I don't know well, or whether it's a sea lion named Tyler that I worked with from his birth through until he was in his 20s, or a beluga whale that I helped raise as a young calf that I got to know very well. Um, there are many, many animals whose lives and whose stories have impacted me greatly and have taught me so much about being a better trainer, about being a better conservationist, about being a better scientist. You We have the ability to take so much information from every animal that we interact with that it's I always am surprised when I come across people who interact with animals but don't feel that they've learned very much or don't feel that those animals have impacted them greatly. Because I feel like I'm impacted by the animals in my life all the time, and it's hard to pick out just one.
Mhm. And the way that you train is so conversational with them too, and really, I feel like empathetic and curious, where of course you're gonna learn, yeah, from each one, and it's so special, and I feel like different species, you probably just tap into different things you wouldn't know until you work with them.
Right, and I think that's the joy of being able to work with so many different species is realizing that there's going to be new discoveries made if I'm training a species that very few people have ever trained before, whether that's sea jellies or butterflies or some unique marsupial in Australia. What that allows me to do is continue my curiosity about that species. And as you know, a big part of training is being in, you said, conversation or dialogue with your learner. And while, of course, most people who don't work with animals closely will go, well, how do you have a dialogue with the animals? So much of that is learning to read their body language, learning to be able to tell when an animal is excited or when an animal is nervous, being able to tell when an animal seems content and happy or when they seem frustrated and uncertain. And that information, when you see it in an animal, changes your response, changes how you behave, changes how you interact. And that dialogue, as I call it, allows me to learn a great deal about the individual animal. And the longer I work with them, the more dialogue I have, the more insight I have into what is going to be comfortable for that animal, what's going to make them happy, what's going to motivate them. And that helps me become a better trainer. And so each new learner, each new animal gives me new insight. And in the big picture, it makes me a better trainer. And so I'm constantly striving to improve the ability to have that dialogue and to improve my skill set in learning how to interpret what I'm seeing to actions that I can take that's going to help that animal's life.
Yeah, 100%. And I want to tie back to when you were saying about the power of observation, even a little more hands off. It reminded me similarly to how we feel when we even watch TV or movies or reality TV. It's like you have these relationships you think with what you're seeing. Obviously, it's different than if you were working on that project hours and hours, days, years. But, a similar type of concept for the everyday person, maybe of thinking they know and care about celebrities or these things through just observation and not actually knowing them.
And it's through those observations that we make assumptions about the way a person feels. And it's one of the things that makes for a great actor is one that can convey emotion through their body language. They don't just have to say, I'm angry at you, or I love you, or anything like that. You can see it in their face. And because we are all humans, we have gotten better and better at reading other humans' body language. And as you think about the fact that you're able to read the body language particularly well of a person that you know well, imagine having that kind of knowledge about a dog, about a cat, about a horse, about an elephant, about an eagle. And as you get to know those animals, you're able to read their body language as well. And I think that that connection that you just made is a great one because I do think that people do recognize that they have the ability to read body language. They do it all the time when they're watching a movie. And sometimes there's no dialogue at all, but there's the music is playing and evoking certain emotions, and you see tears well up in the eyes of the character you're watching on screen, or you see them moving towards something or moving away from something, and you quickly make assumptions about how they're feeling and what their relationship is, or what that they're afraid of something or they're interested in something. And those are the kinds of things that we as animal trainers learn to do as well. We learn to read that body language so that we can help make better decisions about our training.
Yeah, it's like the paying attention to detail and the empathy is so key for as trainers, because you have to kind of notice those subtle changes. But another topic I wanted to quickly pivot into. So most of our listeners are familiar with the concept of positive reinforcement in general, but I'd love to hear in your words, what makes it so meaningful to you personally, and like why you think it's something people across different fields should care about.
I think there's a lot of reasons why I consider myself a positive reinforcement trainer. There's a reason why I teach positive reinforcement training. And there's several things. I mean, first, I find it to be a very humane way of working with animals. It forces you to care about the way an animal feels and the way the animal perceives the world around it. So that's a good starting point. I also think positive reinforcement is important to think about because when used well, when used correctly, it's a very effective way to train. It's a way to teach an animal not just to do something, but to do something because they want to do something because they enjoy it, to do something because they have a desire to accomplish this task, which then makes that task more meaningful and more important to them. I also think for me, positive reinforcement really helps build relationships. When you think about any relationship you have in your life, if someone is kind, if they're caring, if they're funny, if they're enjoyable to go out for a beer with, if they do kind, nice, considerate, thoughtful things, you can't help but enjoy being around them. You can't help but enjoy their company. And it's the same way with our animals, is when we treat them with kindness, when we treat them with, teach them with positive reinforcement, these animals become more connected to you. You gain and build their trust. And as long as you never betray that trust, that becomes a stronger and stronger bond. And so often we desire to have dogs, cats in our lives because we want to build a relationship, because we want that strong bond. And positive reinforcement really helps build that and makes that stronger. So for me, the reasons to focus on positive reinforcement are numerous. And my focus on it is very different when I'm talking to a pet guardian as opposed to talking to a police officer who teaches canines for scent detection work, or a search and rescue trainer who's using a canine for that, or a guide dog trainer. Because for them, the working canine trainer is someone who is needing to get the job done and needs their dogs to respond quickly. And so for them, I still teach positive reinforcement, but my approach, my reasons can be a little bit different. There are some working canine trainers who are not trying to build a relationship, or the relationship is not necessarily important to them. But I have found that when I can show them that positive reinforcement is the way to teach this dog to enjoy their job and thus do their job better, positive reinforcement is the way to get them to be more effective and get better results, then there's a business reason for them to want to train that way. And so positive reinforcement is effective. But when I'm talking with a pet guardian, I can say it will help you have a dog who will listen to you and do the things that you want it to do most of the time. But more importantly, positive reinforcement really helps build that relationship. And isn't that what you want from your dog? Don't you want a good relationship? Don't you want to have a bond that is meaningful to you? And so for me, there's just no line of work or no way or manner that we tend to use animals that I wouldn't find positive reinforcement is the most effective and the best way to go about it, because it's just all around better for the dog, better for your relationship, better for your training, better for success. There's just so many reasons. I'm hard pressed to focus in on just one.
Yeah, well, and you brought up a really good point too of getting to know the needs as well of the different, like in this case, humans, right, that have a guide dog versus maybe like bomb detection dogs versus pet guardians. And I would imagine this is a similar thing you do in your conservation projects too, of figuring out all these different needs, motivations, desires to get to the root of the plan to make it most effective and
Yeah,
ethical.
in a lot of ways, one of the hardest parts about conservation training is not the animal training portion, but it is getting all of the players, all of the people involved in the situation on board and recognizing the value of it. And it's where some of my hardest training takes place is in working with the humans because I'm working with everybody from animal rights organizations to biologists from the university to local people who live among the animals uh, and care about what happens to them. We are also dealing with people like park rangers whose job it is to manage wildlife. You're dealing with just a whole lot of people, and they all have different agendas and different things that are important to them, and not all of them necessarily care about the welfare and well-being of the animals that you're working with. And the example I would give you for that was one of my early introductions to conservation training was the with the Mexican gray wolf. The gray wolf was an endangered species throughout certain parts of North America, and zoological organizations managed to successfully breed them, and part of their goal was to reintroduce them back into the wild. But imagine when they started trying to introduce these wolves back into the forests and wilds of Montana, the farmers and ranchers in that area didn't want them reintroduced. The wolf was a burden to them. It was a risk to their livestock, and so consequently, uh, if you don't put a conservation plan in place that includes working with the local people who have a vested interest in whether those animals live or die, you might not be successful in your conservation efforts. And so the point being is not everybody is going, oh, yes, wolves are lovely. Let's reintroduce them back and replenish the forest with lots of wolves who are going to kill my cattle, threaten my horses, threaten my sheep. All of a sudden, you realize not everybody views conservation in the same way. Not everybody has the same motives and the same objectives. And so, for me, a big part of learning about wildlife conservation is recognizing that not every single individual is going to have the same goals, the same outcomes, or the same thinking about what you're doing. And so, consequently, a big part of that is building relationships, building bridges, helping them to get something out of it, to get their input into the project before you implement it. Conservation training, that's the most difficult part of it, is the legal and human battles that have to be fought. And in the long run, you have to enter into those conversations and into those relationships, not thinking of them as a battle, but thinking of them as let's build consensus and let's find a way to work together. And our goal is, yes, to protect the elephants or to protect the wolves or to protect this particular species, but I also have an interest in helping you live your life better and get from this project what you need to get from it. And for a rancher who's concerned about the health and safety of his cattle or his sheep, that's an important consideration that has to be folded into the thinking because they don't necessarily view the situation the same way a conservationist might.
100%. And I would imagine the past learning that individual stakeholders have with conservationists, because maybe in the past, things were said, this is for conservation, and had more, unintended consequences
Right.
that rubbed them the wrong way. I would imagine that would be harder because now we're dealing with an aversion to the conservationist.
Absolutely. And it's the challenge we all have with training. Even when you're a trainer of of pets for individual pet guardians, not all pet guardians think of their pets in the same way. You know, they look at them differently. They have different feelings. They have different opinions. Everybody's knows somebody who's had a dog and has an opinion about how they should train their dog. And so consequently, as a dog trainer coming into someone's home, you have to realize you're going to be dealing with those biases and perceptions. And a big part of your job, as you know, is training the people, is teaching the people, and recognizing that they are important learners in that process.
Yeah, no, you said that beautifully. And so I guess when you started getting into this work, like these are massive conservation projects that sound like they've taken so long building those relationships, getting those legal policies changed and all of that. So I guess how did you first get started in that? Did they find you from the zoo world or
You know, it's
yeah.
kind of a bizarre, fascinating story about how I got involved. I mean, first, having worked in the zoological world, zoos often are very passionate about conservation and they often do conservation work. Most of their conservation work is usually funding projects being done in the wild by biologists or researchers who are studying the free ranging animals. But occasionally, my early introduction to wildlife conservation was simply realizing that the work I was doing in a zoo might help in the wild. An example was with beluga whales in the wild, belugas in the St. Lawrence River. When they wash ashore, when they die and come onto the beaches, often the Canadian government has to handle them as toxic waste because of the high levels of pollutants that are in the St. Lawrence River. And consequently, the animals have so many toxins in their system. So during an early study that was being conducted by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada, they wanted to compare the blood levels and the physiology of the animals in the wild with healthy animals. And one of the places they could find healthy animals was in a zoological organization. So much of the work that I would do to teach a beluga whale to give me its tail so that I could get a blood sample, voluntary blood sample, ended up contributing significantly to the comparison of sick and dying beluga whales in the wild, and it helped change certain policies. And it was that everyday work that I was doing with the animals as a normal part of my everyday job and seeing how it impacted government policies and helped change uh, information about those whales and change management of those whales in the wild made me start thinking a lot about it. And then in the Canadian government was also looking for a way to track beluga migration and beluga movements, and they wanted to use these little elastic beluga bracelets that had a radio tag inside them, and they wanted to put them around the dorsal fin of beluga whales in the wild to track them. But before they did that, they wanted to test out these bracelets to see that they could be put on a whale without harming the whale, without impeding the whale. So we did a long 2-year study in which we did that with our whales. And once we learned that how to make them safe and not cause abrasions to the animals, those were implemented on whales in the wild, and they were able to really learn new things about their migration habits. And so I kept coming across these opportunities. Another opportunity was when I worked with Alaskan sea otters in Alaska during the Exxon Valdez oil spill back in 1989. Otters were being oiled and coming into rescue centers, and they needed people with handling experience to help clean them up to prepare them for release back into the wild. And as I worked with these animals, handling them every day to clean them up and prepare them for reintroduction back into the wild, I was given a task. I was put in charge of the animals that were going to be reintroduced back into the wild. And we ended up having several hundred of these otters that were being held because they couldn't be released back into the wild because the oil was still there and the cleanup hadn't been completed yet. But the important aspect of the release was the animals, we needed to take good care of them. But we needed the animals not to become dependent on us because we didn't want the animals, once they were back in the wild, seeking out boats or people on the water on the beaches thinking that, oh, these are people that feed me. So we needed to develop remote training techniques that could allow us to care for them well, but for us not to have daily hands-on interaction with the animals. We wanted the animals to be afraid of people. So that meant that the only time they would see our faces was when we were restraining them for medical exams, because we wanted them to be afraid of us. But yet we still needed to provide good care. And so that care had to happen through what we call remote training, where any reinforcement, any food that they were given needed to appear to come to them naturally as opposed to coming from us. And so that taught me, or began my research into how these remote training skills work and how do you train an animal without them knowing that you're training them. And so those were all things that led to me working on projects. And it wasn't until my first really big conservation project that was sort of, I don't want to say alone because you don't do any of these projects alone, but the idea developed within my own brain and I suggested it to somebody. And I think if I had not had people who were receptive to the idea, because most people are not receptive to the idea of training animals in the wild, they don't think it's a good idea. But this particular group of people were receptive to the idea. And because they were receptive and it worked, it made me think, oh, conservation training, this is pretty easy. And it turned out that it wasn't easy, and it doesn't go that easily all the time. And it was just a happenstance. I was doing some training consulting for a zoo. And while I was there, they happened to be involved in a chimpanzee conservation project taking place in Sierra Leone in Western Africa. And they had a couple of park rangers from the from Sierra Leone that were there doing some work with the zoo. I wasn't involved in this work at all, but they had an evening fundraiser for the chimps of Sierra Leone, and the head of the park ranger service did a talk about poaching and about how awful the poaching situation was and how difficult it was to curb poaching. And I watched that presentation and it was heartbreaking, and the images that he showed of the chimps being slaughtered and being taken for a variety of reasons just hurt your heart so much. And it just so happened that I was sitting at the table with a colleague of another park ranger. He wasn't the one doing the presentation, but I was at his table. And again, I want to remind you that I'm there as a guest of the zoo. They just happened to, it just was coincidence that this fundraiser was happening that evening. And the director of the zoo said, Ken, would you like to come to this? It's about chimpanzee conservation. If you'd like to, just be our guest. And so I was sitting at the table next to this park ranger. And after the talk was over, I commented to him that how awful it was, and it must be difficult for you to work in such trying circumstances. And the park ranger said to me, yes, it is terrible. He said, it's just too bad we can't teach the chimps to scream in unison, because if they screamed in unison when a poacher came, we would hear them at the ranger station and we would be able to do something about it. And he said that if we could only teach them. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I said, and I remember saying to him, what was that you just said? Can you say that again? And he goes, oh, I was just saying how sad it was that we couldn't do anything about it. And I said, no. You said something about teaching them. And he goes, oh, it was just a silly fantasy of mine. It's stupid. And I go, no, tell me. And he said, oh, well, it's just that we've noticed that when the chimps get excited and the entire troop, the entire group in a certain area scream all at the same time, it is so loud that we can hear it miles away at the ranger station. And he says, but sadly, when poachers arrive, they don't all scream. They tend to be quiet, they hide, they run, but they don't scream. And so they get slaughtered, bad things happen. And I said, well, gosh, it seems to me that I then it sort of explained that I am a trainer, and that it seemed to me that we could teach the chimps to scream in unison whenever poachers arrived. And he asked me how we could do that, and I explained to him it just so happened that at this particular zoo they were experimenting. I had been working with them on some enrichment devices that enriched animals with these PVC devices that you install in the trees that throw out reinforcers, and you can affect these animals' behavior even when the trainers aren't present. And I thought if we were to use a device like that, we could probably teach the chimps to scream in unison. In fact, if the zoo's okay with it, we could ask them, I could show you the devices that they're using themselves. I think you could retrofit something like that to work in the jungles of Sierra Leone. Now, I had never been to Sierra Leone. I was not familiar. I was just thinking off the top of my head. But this particular park ranger was fascinated by the idea. He brought me and introduced me to his boss, the head of the ranger service. And it was that just fortunate coincidence of an organization that was willing to listen to me, working at a zoo where they already had these devices, and me just happened to be sitting at the table next to this park ranger to have this conversation that sparked this idea, in which we then finally went out and implemented the idea. And after 2 years of working on the project, poaching in the national parks in Sierra Leone was reduced by 86%, an
Wow.
86% reduction in poaching. And and it was a very, very successful project, and one that, and it's again the unique good fortune that Sierra Leone, sadly, does not have a democratic system of government. And the reason that that worked in my favor is that these particular park rangers could do whatever they wanted. And so because they liked the idea, they were able to implement this without having to go through a lot of legal hurdles. Never had the ability to do that in any other project. But that led me to a project in Australia with a little animal called a bilby. They had seen and heard and read papers about the fact that we'd changed the behavior of these wild ranging chimps and saved them from poaching. In Australia, there was a highway that had been constructed that accidentally forced these bilbies closer to an urban center, and feral cats were coming out and killing the bilbies. And there was this desire to relocate the bilbies to another location so that they wouldn't be subject to these feral cats. And again, they heard about that project, and so we did that particular project. Word got out as the papers got presented about that particular project. Suddenly, I had now two different conservation projects, and that led me to a third, a fourth, till now I've done dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And now it's not as hard to get people to understand the possibilities, because we have the Bilby project and the chimpanzee project and the macaw reintroduction project in Argentina. We have polar bears in Alaska. We have elephants in Zambia. We have many, many, many projects that we have been involved in, all different animals, all different types of behaviors that we've tried to change. And now that I've done as many of them as I now have this background of research and examples where I can bring in and show people how we managed to accomplish this without affecting the animals in a negative way, without teaching the animals to become dependent on humans, to keep the animals wild and free ranging, yet still change their behavior in significant ways. And so it has become this unique niche for me that I would have never imagined, but that's how it started. It started first with just the normal job that I did as a normal trainer working in a zoo, that led me to doing projects more and more complicated and more advanced and more not related to zoo work at all, that's how it started. And I'm sorry that was a convoluted story. I apologize for going
No,
on
I
so
loved it.
long.
No need to apologize. As you were speaking, I was just like, wow, this is one of those synchronicities. I feel like I talk about this a lot because I don't know if you consider yourself a spiritual person at all, but sometimes I dabble in the woo woo, and I'm like, I think that these things are just, I don't know, when they all these things start aligning up for this huge impact. I choose to believe that there's something magical there happening, and that's beautiful. That you're like, it just happened to be there,
Yeah,
and it's turned into this massive, yeah, huge
but people
impact.
often ask about how did you strategically design, how did you make it happen? And it was in almost all cases that I've worked on, I don't make it happen. It's not me that makes it happen. There's usually an interest in somebody in seeing some problem solved. If I think of a behavioral solution, I present it to them, and then I leave it to them to come back to me and say, I don't know the species as well as you. I don't know the political situation as well as you. You tell me what's necessary to make it happen, and if you're interested, I'm happy to work on it. And once I'm involved, I'll work on it night and day. I'll give it all of my effort, but it does require more people involved. It's always a team effort. The elephant project that I'm working on in Zambia, I think there's like 220 some people that are involved in the project, and from many different walks of life. There's the University of Lusaka in Zambia that has researchers that are involved. There's Elephant Conservation International that's based out of South Africa that's involved. There are the park rangers that are involved. There are individual native tribes that live along the route, and their village elders or their tribe elders are involved. There are these various specialized conservation groups, the Friends of the Zebra, who want to make sure that zebras aren't negatively impacted by this elephant project. There's the Protectors of the Wildebeests, who want to make sure that they are heard and that whatever we're doing with these elephants aren't going to impact the wildebeest. And so there's the Giraffe Conservation Project that wants to make sure that giraffes aren't impacted by them. They're just dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations, all with different agendas, all with different needs that are involved in these projects. And so it a lot of pieces have to fall into place. And so when they do, it does feel like whether you want to call it divine intervention, whether you want to call it that the stars have lined up appropriately, I don't know what it is, but I can't deny that if it's certainly been a lot of unusual coincidences that have happened, and I'm fine if it's just been luck and chance, then that's good too. Then I've got good luck in that regard. So
No, 100%. And I love that you talk about how collaborative it is. And
yes,
one thing I was hearing that sounded a little bit like a pattern, if this was to be replicated, is first, like knowing or, yeah, being familiar with the zoo world, I think has been helpful because they have all these enrichment plans that they've learned and probably evolved and
right.
changed and continue to grow.
Yes,
And then also knowing the actual issues and having relationships in that space. If you're not able to go there, then you got to know somebody who's there. Otherwise, you'd be that foreigner who's like, I know what's best,
yeah.
and
And,
yeah.
and that's where knowing your limitations are important. When I come into a project like this, I come into it saying, look, what I know best is behavior and how to change behavior. I don't need to be an elephant expert. I don't need to be a bilby expert. In fact, when I was first called to work on a bilby project, I was going, yes, this sounds exciting. I'm so excited to do it. And as soon as I was embarrassed to say, I didn't know what the heck a bilby was. I had to Google it to find out what it actually was. But the reason I feel comfortable and confident going into those situations is that I know that it's going to be a collaborative process. I can go in and say, what I understand really well is behavior. What I don't know is I don't know bilbies. So I'm going to need biologists, behaviorists, people who know the bilby. I need to know what they eat. I need to know what their sensory mechanisms are. I need to know more about their natural history. I am not ever going to become an expert on that particular species. But if I have team members who are working with me on the project who are experts on the species, if I have government individuals who understand the laws related to the species in that area, I then begin gathering a team of people who can work collaboratively on the project to make it a reality, because then you have people who have the strengths in those particular areas that you need them to be in.
Yeah, it's so important. And so I have a specific scenario. The first time I ever heard of this issue, it's conservation and kind of dog training related.
Mhm.
The first time I ever heard of this issue, I was like, Ken Ramirez has got to get in on this. So I just was like, I'll pick your brain. And I know we'll have, it's a short or small context in a podcast, but I'll give you the context and our listeners. But so this was a real life scenario. I was visiting the Cheetah Conservation Fund in Namibia and was
Okay,
learning. You might be familiar with them already too, but for our listeners, in case they're not, we'll assume, yeah, they don't. But we're learning about the challenges they're facing with teaching their livestock guardian dogs to avoid snakes. And for context, their program significantly reduced human wildlife conflict by these dogs protecting livestock, similar to what you were saying, where in turn, it was preventing retaliation killings of predators. So they provide like trained dogs to farmers along with ongoing education and vet care. It's a great program.
that's great.
But they've experimented with aversive techniques where they were like spraying water at the dogs at the sight or scent of a snake, and then some dogs developed generalized fear and were removed from the program. But they're like, well, it's saving their lives on one level, but and then they attempted a positive reinforcement approach trying to improve their systems, but it wasn't done fully effective, where the dogs were becoming more interested in the snakes.
Right.
I don't have much more information as the protocol they were using, but given your experience pioneering positive snake aversion training in the US, I was curious how you would approach this situation, and especially when resources are limited and the dogs are working independently in high arousal environments. I had no idea how to solve it.
It's a great question, and it's not one that I have to do a lot of speculation about because I have worked in that area. In fact,
Okay.
not only have I done a lot of positive reinforcement snake avoidance training here in the US, part of the elephant project ended up becoming a snake avoidance project because in Zambia there are conservation issues with the spitting cobra, the black mamba, and the puff adder. All three are highly venomous snakes that are being killed by farmers and ranchers and others because of the fact they just don't want these snakes hurting their wildlife. And since I spend a month in Zambia every single year, um, someone had heard about the positive reinforcement techniques that we were using, and the question was, could we use the technique, that same technique, with these venomous snakes in Zambia? And we've been very successful at it. This is a project that I am actively involved in right now. I mean, literally,
Ooh.
I was in contact with a couple of trainers of dogs in Zambia just 2 days ago, and it's a project that we're working on. We now have 36 park rangers and other trainers that are working on the project with a number of different dogs. And what we decided to do and the way we approach the project is the visual presence, or the odor of the snakes ends up being what we worked with most, because of the fact that most of the animals there, they don't have a sound. They can't have, like a rattlesnake here in the US, you can use the sound of the rattle as a cue. But there, we're using the odor of the snake as the cue, or a visual of the snake. But sometimes the snakes are hidden and they are not seen until it's too late or you're too close. We use the visual odor of the snake to cue the animal to recall, to do like an emergency recall. As soon as they smell that snake, they come back to their owner. And we added to that an alert, meaning that when they get to their owner, they will herd their owner away from the snake. So what it's done is it's given the dog something to do that is not investigating the snake. I think that the difference in, for example, explosive detection or narcotic detection, you're teaching the dog to look for, find, and alert that there is this odor. In this particular case, we don't want them looking for it. We teach them to go about their normal everyday lives. But if in the course of your everyday life you get a strong whiff of that snake, you're going to turn and run back to your owner and herd and push your owner away from the snake. And that behavior will indicate, of course, to your owner that they found a snake and that you're going to move away from that particular area. So what that's done is it doesn't cause the snakes, it doesn't cause the snakes, it doesn't cause the dogs to go searching for the snakes, to go, they're not finding them. You don't teach them that their job should be to go find a snake. Their job is just to do what they normally do, whether it's herding their sheep or their goats or doing whatever it is that they're doing. And only when they come across it are they then supposed to herd the people away. And what that's done is it doesn't cause the dogs to be overly sensitized to looking for snakes, but when they encounter one, they respond in that way. And so far, the results of that project have been really, really good. In fact, probably the my favorite story just happened just last year in my last visit to Zambia. We were teaching a new group of handlers this protocol, and they're going to start. They were going to start working on it, and one of the park rangers, Kiri, he had a dog. He had two dogs that he had trained to do snake avoidance training, and I was working with his dog. His two dogs were named Fred and Barney, which I found hilarious just because I found it interesting that this Zambian ranger named his dogs after a Flintstones cartoon characters. But so I was demonstrating with Barney to the group how we had put the odor we used the shedded skin of a black mamba, and we put the odor in a hidden location in a below a tree that was way 100 yards ahead of me. And I was showing them how we were going to do the training, that we would guide the animals, and your goal as the handler is just to not know where the scent is. You know it's at the tree, but pretend you don't know, and you don't try to cue your dog, and you start working toward it. And as the dog approaches, as soon as you see their nose flare and you see they get the odor of the snake, you're going to sound your recall cue and have them come back to you. So I was demonstrating this with Barney, and we were probably 100 yards from where the odor had been hidden. And all of a sudden, we came up to this bush. Barney's nose flared, and he came back to me. I didn't have to sound the recall. He already knew how to do it. He came rushing back to me and pushed me away from the area. And Kiro, his trainer, responded by going, "No, no, Barney, you're not supposed to do it. You didn't." And I said, wait, just a second. I think the way he responded, I'm positive, but we must have dropped a scent. We must have dropped something there. He's so strongly responding. I have a feeling we must have put something down there. And Kira goes, "No, he didn't." And he took a stick and started looking in the leaves there below this tree, this bush that we were at, and all of a sudden, out of the leaves becomes this black mamba, and I thought, oh my goodness, Barney just saved my life, and every single one of our students was like, oh, and it was the best example of how effective it can be. Barney had actually alerted on a real live snake that was in our training area that we didn't realize was there. And
Wow.
we were just coming up to that particular area when Barney responded like he had been trained to do and pushed me away. And when Kira went in and uncovered the snake and it slithered away, it gave us chills. But at the same time, I was like, always trust your dog. Once you've trained your dog to do a task like that, and you've trained it well, he's not going to alert unless there really is the odor of a snake there. And so it was that was one of those life defining moments in the sense that it saved my life. I mean, I literally was about to step right in that direction, and
Wow.
it was a great demonstration to the team just how valuable a well trained dog can be and how effective it can be at coming away from the snake. And by doing that, you're protecting the people, you're protecting the dog, and you're protecting the snake, which is the goal of
Hmm.
snake conservation.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. So I would imagine then in this like scenario, if there's not a person there though, so let's say like the dog's role is like protecting the livestock, the farmer's not there and the dog's just independently like my biggest thing is just scaring off like cheetahs, leopards, hyenas. um I'm like, how would you have them prioritize? Like, okay, if there was a snake, then would it be like go to station or go somewhere else? Or is it no, just keep your distance and fend off the predator?
There's three different approaches, and it would be for me, from my perspective, I would want to ask the the end user, what is your goals here? What do you want the dog to be able to do? When we're hiking in the forest, we want our dog to protect us and alert us. If you're talking about a livestock guarding dog, for example, that might be out in the field and you're not there, what do you want the dog to do if they get the odor of a snake? Do you want them to herd the livestock away from the predator? Do you want the dog to go and ring a bell to alert you off at the farmhouse that you want to come out and do something about it? Or do you want the dog to try to chase off the predator, the snake?
Mm.
And my the first two options I think are good ones. The third one is a bad one. You if you I would never actually want to teach the dog to try to chase the snake off. That's the way to put your dog in danger. That's the way that the dog is going to get itself bitten and killed. And so the goal should always be to avoid those snakes. Don't make them afraid of the snake, but give them another task to do. The presence of the snake means I need to herd my person away, or means I need to go and ring a bell, or means I need to go and herd my livestock. Those are things that you can teach the dog to do. There's a high motivation for them to do that, and it's a way to get the animals potentially away from the predator. So usually when I start a project like this, it's usually sitting down with the people that are involved. And, you know, in many cases, you're going to find that various farmers or ranchers are going to have differing opinions about what they want that dog to do. And so
Mhm.
for a larger project like this, it's like, okay, what can we design that would be most useful for the largest number of people who are going to want to have this
Mm.
happen? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of more detailed questions that need to be answered to be able to come up with a good plan. But as I've explained to you, obviously we've already done a snake avoidance plan that has worked really well for us. Um, it's just a question of potentially adapting that for that particular situation. And how is this related to cheetah conservation? I'm curious.
Yeah, so in that area of Namibia, there are a higher like percentage of cheetahs in that area compared to in other places in Africa. And so at the time, there were lots of livestock being killed by predators, and many of the farmers were assuming that it was cheetahs that were doing it. And so they would kill cheetahs out of retaliation for killing their livestock. And then it was greatly impacting like cheetahs conservation and just like population levels in general, when in reality a lot of times actually different predators were also killing the livestock. It wasn't just cheetah. So the livestock guardian dogs, them barking at and keeping predators away, cheetahs in particular are very like nervous and scaredy cats, so they tend to just run right off. So therefore it saves them and saves the livestock. And so it's reducing retaliation killings, and farmers are still able to have their well-being protected because that livestock is essentially giving their families like the ability to live and eat and thrive, and it's their main source of income and well-being.
Yeah, and I do think one of the things that this is a different project, but livestock guarding dogs are excellent at alerting and chasing off predators that come in, and it's not a hard thing to teach a livestock guarding dog to scare off cheetahs. That would be a relatively easy thing for that dog to do. And it's just about really getting the getting the right training in so that that dog learns that that's part of its job. You know, it's
Yeah, because they have so many dogs in the program. It's like a true like it's kind of like a whole system of like, yeah, we get all these dogs up and running, put them out in the community and like continue educating, but it would have to be, yeah, just the solution I think would have to be that good training, almost making that a protocol
like,
or coming up with something unique for at least Namibia, in that space. So
and
it's
that's
fascinating.
exactly that's the most important thing about any type of conservation training is realizing that it does have to be fitted to that community, to the animals that are involved, so that it works for everybody, so that the people who are living in that area have to be an integral part of the planning process so that they are bought into it, believe in it, and have agreed to it from the beginning and are a participant in making it happen.
hmm And my last question on that specific context would be in like a high arousal moment where let's say a dog's mid chase, chasing off let's say a leopard, and then there happens to be a snake. Are they able to access like scent that well in a high arousal chase? Like for that, do you think in your
That's a
experience?
good question. I'd have to look into it a little bit. We most scent detection, most snake avoidance work that I've done has not been in a high arousal state. So I can't speak with confidence, and I can see why you're asking the question because generally, when a dog is in a highly aroused state, as you know, they become very single minded. They're thinking about whatever it is that's causing them the arousal. And it's when dogs can easily get hurt. They run into danger without recognizing it. That it's not that their nose quits working, but all of their energies are directed toward either chasing away or escaping or doing something depending upon why they're in a high arousal state. But that would be a really important question to ask when developing this project. And so and even if I'm not working on the project, just the fact that you asked that question is going to prompt me to go look into scent detection effectiveness under high arousal conditions because I'm willing to bet that that in certain, whether it's the University of Florida, the University of Virginia, both who do a lot of really good scent detection research, law enforcement officers are going to want to know the answers to that question. So I would bet there have been studies done because of the fact that scent detection is an important part of a lot of law enforcement work. And often law enforcement work also includes getting dogs into a high aroused state. And so consequently, there has to be studies uh, that have been done about that. I just have not run into that myself. And so I'm going to look into it as
Wow.
soon as we finish this conversation.
Well, I'm flattered that I just came up with that question. I'm like, wow, okay.
No, it's a really good question, and but I don't know the answer to that. But it's one worth investigating, and I think there probably are good places to look for the answers to that question. So, but
Yeah.
that would be an important consideration when putting together a good plan in that kind of a situation.
Yeah, it's such a unique when I was hearing about it, I was like, I like to think outside the box and it really blew my mind. I'm like, I don't have the answers to this one. So yeah, it's as with anything, I feel like there's so much more complexity, but I think if you really look into things, there are solutions,
Yeah,
but
there
it's
are.
yeah, it might just take longer to get there.
And you have to realize that not all the solutions are always going to be practical, and that ends up becoming a part of determining whether or not this impractical idea can be made more practical, or is it just not worth investigating? But I don't think you can just discount an idea just because it seems impractical. It just requires more investigation, more thought, more conversations, more discussions with the individuals that would be involved to understand, well, what is practical, what could be possible, how could we modify this to make it more realistic. Those are important things, and it's a big part of these kinds of discussions. Every time I enter into the planning for something like this, it's always about let's not shoot any idea down. Let's put everything out there on the put it all on the board, and then we'll discuss what the risks, what the challenges are for each one, and then determine whether they're worth pursuing, whether they're worth investigating. And that's where a big team of people involved in the process is really important.
I know. I'm like, gosh, I'd love to be a fly on the wall for that because that's just brilliant problem solving and that's really good science in action.
Yeah.
So love that. Well, so that answered like all my questions I had, but my audience, when I told them I was interviewing you, gave me some really good questions that like we could probably maybe get through like one or two just
Sure.
quickly, but if that works for you, and then
It works for
we'll
me.
wrap up.
Yeah,
Awesome.
not a
Okay.
problem.
So one of them being was for those who might still misunderstand positive reinforcement as being overly permissive or just about handing out treats, what do you wish more people understood about the depth, nuance, and science behind it?
Yeah, first of all, that is a common misconception well, yeah, you could use positive reinforcement, but it really means your animal can do anything at once, that you're too permissive, that you're too, and that just isn't necessarily true. You could set rules in place, like for example, I believe in positive reinforcement management. I'm going to reinforce my employees. I'm going to set up a good working environment, but if I'm managing a bank and I find out that one of the tellers took $100 out of the till and put it in his pocket, it doesn't mean that I can't fire him. I mean, I need to set expectations up. I need to have done a good job of training. I need to make sure they understand that that money is not theirs and they cannot just borrow it or take it. But it doesn't mean you can't use positive reinforcement to teach alternative behaviors. It's I also believe in raising kids using positive reinforcement. But just because you're a positive reinforcement parent doesn't mean your child can do anything they want, eat anything they want. You are going to protect your child from risk. You're going to tell your child that if you're on the 20th floor on a balcony that the child can't balance on the rail. That's just not going to be acceptable to you ever. And so you're going to set clear guidelines. But as a positive reinforcement trainer, I'm not going to wait for my child to climb up the rail to yell at him and say, don't do it. What I'm going to do instead is, before he's ever allowed to go onto the balcony, I need to make sure that A, he's old enough, B, that he understands the rules, understand why that's important, make sure I give him other things that are acceptable to do. And if I know that he's a rebellious little child who doesn't listen to my instructions, well, then probably I'll keep the balcony locked and never let him out there. But there are ways that you can set up your environment so that it's not easy for your dog or your learner to do the inappropriate thing. You can set boundaries and say this is not acceptable. And if it happens, you find a way to deal with it, to interrupt it, to stop it in the moment, and then realize, okay, I've got more training that needs to be done. Positive reinforcement is not about being super permissive and super kind and super letting any animal do anything at once. I find that a good set of rules helps make positive reinforcement more effective. And it's critical in our society, whether you're a person or a dog or anybody, we all have rules that we have to follow. We have social mores that we have to fit into. And so just because you use positive reinforcement doesn't mean you you have to allow your dog to do anything at once. When dogs exhibit unwanted behavior, and here's the challenge, and this is a big philosophical diversion. The big challenge that I have is that so many things that are unacceptable to us about dogs are natural things for dogs to do. So dogs bark, dogs dig, dogs roll around in smelly stuff, dogs, and all of those are natural things for a dog. My belief is I want to allow my dogs to do the things that are good for them under the right conditions. You know, if I'm gonna let my dog run in the field, I don't care if he rolls around in the smelliest thing around, but he's got to learn that when he comes back, he's not going to be let into the house until we've cleaned him up or done something else. And so it's finding alternatives, finding options that are acceptable, and finding ways of setting up your environment so that it's hard for the dog to do the wrong thing and easy for the dog to do the right thing or the good thing or the thing that you would like him to do. And so it does require extra thought, but I am not a person who considers myself super permissive. People who visit me and see my dogs are always like, wow, your dogs are so well behaved. Yes, because I've trained them. It doesn't mean that they don't bark at certain times when I wish they wouldn't. It doesn't mean that if I leave a really smelly piece of meat on the counter and walk out of the room that they're not going to jump up and try to grab it. What it means is I have to be more thoughtful about how I set the environment up so that they can be successful and it makes it easier for them to follow the rules. So there's a lot wrapped up into that question, but I tend to be a very big rule follower and I want my dogs and my animals to follow the rules, but I'm going to make it easy for them to be successful. I'm going to make sure to reinforce them when they do it correctly. And if they make a mistake, if they do something that that I don't want them to do, then I absolutely will find a way to stop it from happening in that moment. And then I go to myself, I need to go back and train. I need to prepare for that. Or I put my dog in a bad situation. I shouldn't have put him in this situation when I knew he wasn't ready for it yet. And so there are ways to set it up so that you can be successful and still use positive reinforcement in your training. It's kind of a convoluted answer, and I don't know that I answered it well, but it's
You
just that there's a
did.
lot packed into that question.
No, I thought you answered that very eloquently and beautifully because you're speaking on things that I know that have trouble articulating in that way. And I was like, yeah, you touched all those points. And I like the use of the word thoughtful, especially because I think I haven't been using that word as much, but I'm always like, oh, expectations, but it's also just this thoughtful awareness.
Right.
And then when things don't go according to plan, being like, okay, yes, this my dog's doing a natural behavior. I need to work on this more or think differently on how to make sure that doesn't happen again through rearranging the environment.
Right.
But it's that thoughtfulness piece that I think people get a little bit too frustrated in the moment, or they might not have that background info or
Oh,
know what to do, and and they're on their last nerve because they had a
yes.
bad day. But the more we can be more thoughtful, the better.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Well, maybe we could get to one to two more. So, one was, do you think an animal's internal state, so like illness, fatigue, or pain, would be considered an antecedent, even if we can't see it? And would you consider internal systems to technically be a part of the environment that influences behavior?
First of all, I have two answers to that question. The simple answer is yes. I think the way an animal feels, whether they're sick, whether they're tired, their internal state absolutely affects their behavior. No question about it. I don't think anybody would argue with that. Whether someone would call it an antecedent, I think it is. For people who don't understand what an antecedent is, it is just the thing in the things that are in the environment that triggers, causes, prompts behavior to happen. I see a spider in my environment, I move away. I see a piece of chocolate, I move in toward it because I like chocolate. Those are antecedent arrangements that are there that can cause me, can affect behavior. But at the same time, if I come into a situation where I've just eaten a huge amount of food and I'm feeling really sluggish, it's possible that that really tasty piece of chocolate isn't appealing to me. It might actually make me feel bad and make me kind of move away. Those are the kinds of things where the chocolate is an antecedent, but so is the fact that I'm feeling sluggish and full. And so consequently, all of those things are going to affect the picture of what's going to motivate me to or not to do something. So, yes, that was my long way of saying yes, I believe those things affect behavior. And I do think they should be considered a part of the environmental arrangement, the antecedent arrangement that sets the picture for what's going to prompt or discourage certain behaviors.
Mm. And like it that could tie into like emotions in a way. And I've heard in some like behavior spaces being like, oh, emotions aren't really a part of like the equation, it's the behavior. And I've heard on the other side, but I kind of feel like it's the chicken or the egg. They kind of feed into both, is my personal view on it.
No, you're right.
Um, and yeah, and just was like, because I feel like sometimes it's like, oh, we have a something in our body that creates that emotion, and sometimes our emotions create things in our body. So it's
And I think
fascinating.
I think there both ways of looking at it depend upon the perspective you bring to the equation. Sometimes what some very strict trainers will say, and I will say this at times, is that if you do not know the emotion of your animal, which you may not, you can't assume something and make a training decision based on what that animal's thinking. Your training decisions need to be based on what you see the animal doing at the time. That's just a really good, clean way of thinking of behavior.
Mhm.
But that's just the very strictly training lens. You cannot shape emotion, you're shaping behavior. However,
Mhm.
as a thinking, caring, empathetic individual, should I consider that the fact that my dog just came in from outside where he was barking at something outside for the last 15 minutes and he's all amped up? Yes. It doesn't mean that if he does an inappropriate behavior that I'm going to accept that behavior, but I have to be understanding that that emotion is going to affect his behavior. And so perhaps I shouldn't ask for a behavior that requires a lot of thought and precision immediately after he's been through this emotional experience. I'm not
Mhm.
I would be setting him up for failure if I were to ask him to engage in a very thoughtful exercise while he's all amped up because of something he's seen. And so, as a thoughtful, empathetic, caring trainer, I'm going to use the fact that I'm aware that he's in an emotional state to change the decision about what I'm going to work on or what I'm going to ask for in this situation. Or if I need him to do this thing right now, then I need to change something about what I'm doing to make it easier for him to focus and help him to forget what just happened. So if he doesn't do what I want him to do, I'm not going to reinforce him just because I know he's in an emotional state. I'm just going to understand why he didn't do it and maybe change my plan. And so that's where you're using your knowledge of that dog's emotions to make decisions, but you're not making training decisions based on what you think the dog is feeling.
Mhm.
Behavior training is really about reinforcing good behavior, not reinforcing good thoughts. But good thoughts will result in better behavior. It's just a matter of recognizing where the two separate. And it's not that they operate in separate spheres, but when you're thinking about behavior, you have to sort of think about what it is that's happening at the time. But as a big picture thinker, you have to be aware of the feelings and emotions that an animal has and be aware that they're going to impact his or her behavior.
Yeah, and that curiosity piece, because I feel like I was listening to something where Chirag Patel was talking about how like we don't actually really know that the thought, like the emotions matching the behavior, right? And it makes sense when you hear it like that of or how many times it's like we can suppress a behavior and be like, oh, he's relaxed because we think they are, but they're sitting there not. But on the flip side, maybe there are times that we think they're afraid and we're mislabeling it, or there's so many nuances that are
There
just
are.
fascinating to be curious about.
Right, right.
Okay, well, our last things I might want to be mindful and respectful of your time, but if we were to leave listeners with like one thing to focus on right now, what do you think is like the most urgent or impactful thing of how they can show up in their daily lives, no matter their line of work?
It's a hard one to say one thing, but I guess they're all connected. There's three or four things that connect to each other, and one of those is to remember that there's your learner, your animal has a lot going on in its life. There's a lot of things happening in its brain, and you need to be better about reading your animal's behavior, being thoughtful about what you do and how you interact with them. And I always remind people, I like to paraphrase something B.F. Skinner said because, when people are like, when I'm teaching people about getting rid of unwanted behavior or dealing with animal mistakes, I like to quote Skinner. And Skinner, to paraphrase him, he said, animals never make mistakes. They behave the way they do based on their past experience in that situation. And the reason I like to remind people of that is I don't think our dogs are being vindictive or mean or trying to get back at you by doing an unwanted behavior. They're doing the unwanted behavior because that behavior worked for them. It got some result from you that they liked, that they wanted, that they were hoping for. And so I think for us, it puts us in a much more thoughtful, kind, empathetic point of view when you realize, all right, I don't like the fact that my dog is scratching at the door right now, but he's been doing it for a while. Clearly, it's reinforcing to him. Clearly, he doesn't think he's making a mistake. Probably the way I have responded to that behavior in the past caused him to think that it's going to generate something from me and get some response from me that he finds reinforcing. And so it's really constantly looking at the world in that way, is looking at saying, let me see what my dog is telling me, and let me recognize that my dog is not vindictive, is not trying to get me. And I'm not saying that that's never the case with a dog, but what I will say is, in my experience, it's rarely the case. The dog wants to succeed, and figuring out what it is they want, why they want it, are part of the joys of being a pet parent. Is part of our job, is to learning how to read their behavior and learn how to adapt to what they are showing us. So for me, those are all connected responses.
I agree. No, it's beautiful. And I guess if people want to follow more of your work, I know you have several books and that you're very involved in, obviously, Karen Pryor Academy. But if people want to follow you on social media, learn more about your work, or they're like, I just need more of Ken, where should they find you?
They can follow me on Instagram. I have periods of time when I post lots of stuff, and there are times when I'm sort of a little bit more quiet. But my Instagram is Ken_Ramirez_KPCT, and KPCT is Karen Pryor Clicker Training. So Ken_Ramirez_KPCT. And they, of course, can go to the Karen Pryor Academy website, or the Karen Pryor Clicker Training website, where they can find out about what I'm doing at the ranch. I have a ranch in Washington State at the base of Mount Rainier, and there's always courses that we're teaching there. And also on that website, I often post blogs and things like that. So those are ways that you can hear about or learn about what I'm up to and what I'm doing.
Well, beautiful. And I'll post a lot of that in our show notes too. And thank you so much again, Ken, and not just for being here today, but also just the work you've devoted your life to. And you're changing the way we all relate to animals. And I feel like on behalf of all of us trainers, but also all of those without a voice, thank you. Your impact's profound. And I'm very grateful that you chose to share this time with us today.
Well, thank you, Ashley. I appreciate being here and appreciate you giving me a place to share this information with you. So good job.
Thanks for hanging out with me on the Co-Regulated Canines podcast. If you love this episode, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed, left a review, and shared with a friend. Your support helps more people and their dogs find a little more ease and connection in their lives. Want to dive deeper? Follow me on Instagram at Co-Regulated Canines. That's CO_regulated, the letter K, the number 9, S, or head to www.coregulatedcanines.com for more resources. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your pup, and keep building those connections.